Spirit healing.
Spirit healing means healing through the spirit, a healing through the power of the spirit, in collaboration as well as triggered and directed through the material consciousness and its power. With an illness, the consciousness and its powers of the concerned human being must be activated. That is to say, the power of the consciousness must become stimulated and made more useful. Thereto very long and explaining and advisory conversations on a purely logical basis are required for the still uncomprehending human being, and that is the case with the majority of the terrestrial humankind, especially, however, with the so-called parapsychologists and the God-believers that stimulate the human beings to the thinking, after which he or she then is able to provide him or herself the knowledge required in his or her own thought work. Thereby not until he/she is willing to use the power of his or her consciousness and to make him or herself healthy again. This extraordinarily consciousness-based hard work, namely the productive, neutral positive thinking, that the suffering and ill human being must him or herself practice, because the aid, helper, the so-called spiritual healer in third person, cannot take on, assume, the consideration, thought work, of another human being. He/she, so to speak, can only throw the stone of the impulse, cause that, however, the one struck must cure him or herself of the developing wound or bump. Through the so-called magnetopathic currents/powers, which in truth represent nothing other than the aura radiance, thus the cosmos-electrical life energy, may be an aid, helper, a so-called spiritual healer, to help an ill fellow human being. However, the fundamental assistance lies with the suffering human being, him or herself, because he or she must carry out his or her own healing through his or her own powers. That means in this case thus, that he or she must first him or herself create a healthy, neutral, positive mode of thinking. The actual process of a healing through a so-called spiritual healer is to be explained very simply through the will of the healer. He or she uses his or her consciousness power to capture in him or herself manifold greater cosmos electrical energies, and he or she needs for him or herself. He/she thus, so to speak, oversaturates him or herself with these cosmos electrical energies. The healer unloads, discharges, now this mulch energy into the body the alone patient, or of the one to calm down, whereby first and foremost an alleviation is brought about in the matter of the suffering. This effect is comprehensible for this reason, because the suffering through his or her disastrous thing, which he or she frequently brought about him/herself through a wrongly steered or at the very least negatively influenced psyche, which the normal cosmos electrical energies penetrating in him or her transforms into negative and destructive forms, or simply unconsciously, senselessly uses it up. Thus the so-called spiritual healer transfers only new cosmic electrical life energy into the ill one, patient. Thus to him or her this power again becomes one's own and lets him or her become healthy. The so-called spiritual healer practically charges the suffering one thus only with new cosmos electrical life energies, which immediately yield their effect. In this regard, a precisely same process takes place, like when an empty used battery is recharged, when to it new energies become supplied. With spiritual healer or healer in the vernacular refers to all those human beings who through their consciousness powers can be of help for their fellow human beings in the above-mentioned kind and wise. As a rule, with such spiritual healers it acts itself around human beings who have completed absolutely no medical or similar schools, so they thus neither learn to become doctors nor psychiatrists or have similar professions. But it is precisely in this field that tremendously much charlatanry and deceiving is practiced, which is not too difficult for many conmen with good familiar names, because they can rely on the far cultivated belief and deluded belief of innumerable human beings. These charlatans and deceivers, namely, who above all also profit from the insane assertions and the non-understanding of the things of the parapsychologists, understand that, to convince the suffering ones through suggestion and belief addressing of it, that they, the cheating spirit-healing ones, and so on, are precisely able to fulfill, although they do not even command over the most elementary basic knowledge of the spirit-healing. Thus with the actions of these cheating healers it acts itself in truth, not around spiritual healers, but rather, as a rule, around money-hungry deceivers and charlatans, who themselves rely on the belief and delusional belief-orientedness of their followers and clients/customers. This kind of so-called healer, in truth, practices belief and prayer healing. This lies therein ensured, that the suffering and ill one simply believes in it. In this way then, in belief-based form, a self-healing occurs, that, how could it also be different, that it is attributed to the so-called healer, who thereby in addition finds loyal followers. When healing is practiced in the form of suggestion or from belief, then this in no wise represents a spirit healing, and it also in no form has anything to do with an advisory or calming function, but rather entirely alone only with the belief of the suffering one, who, as a rule, is shamefully abused for financial greedy purposes.